This is a presentation based on Leila Ahmed's book Women and Gender, which is for the Edexcel A-Level in Religious Studies, focusing on the final topic on religion and society, which has this set text by Leila Ahmed. And before we look at the annotations and we think a little bit about what she says in her chapter conclusions, let's have a little thought about her life, the context in which her book is written in, and I think it's quite helpful. So Leila Ahmed is born in 1940, just outside of Cairo in Egypt. And she was exposed to Islam by her mother and her grandmother, and they both taught her this unique relationship that women had with Islam. And there's an emphasis here where she made a distinction between the more lived experience of Islam rather than the legalistic, ritualistic aspects of Islam. And that was her experience of Islam growing up. And then in 1952, there was the Egyptian Revolution, and there was Arab nationalism that was resurgent at the time. And it caused her father, who was a civil engineer, to lose his job because he opposed the Aswan High Dam project, which the leader at the time who came to power, Nasir, he wanted this dam project, and her father opposed the regime. And as a consequence, he lost his job and things were very difficult. At that time, because of the Arab nationalism, there was a lot of segregation. So people looked upon who at one time were friends, Jews and Christians, of Muslims, they were now on the other side. And so her family, because her father opposed the leader's project, were also considered by many to be on the other side. And that was because her family were far more progressive. They were interested in Western culture and education. Leila Ahmed had a dream to study abroad at college. And during this period of time, she felt that the dream was going to come to an end. In fact, she has one anecdotal story of being in a school when she was younger and was slapped in the face by a Palestinian teacher for identifying as Egyptian instead of being Arab. She also later on attended English-speaking schools in Cairo, so there was still this Western influence that she was exposed to. But even though she was akin with Western European experiences, she also experienced a lot of racism and a lot of stereotyping from her British teachers at the time, who treated her differently to the others. Then we get to the 1960s, and she manages to make it to England, and she goes to Cambridge University. And there she found that her peers had a simplistic view of Arab culture at the university. They didn't really seem to grasp or understand what it was like. And also her American and European friends at the university were buying into either forms of socialism or nationalism at the time. But she was very wary of those things, having seen the impact in Egypt. So while she was in Cambridge, she started to form a very balanced view. She didn't want to give in to extremist ideology, and she also didn't want to oversimplify the complexity of the issues facing Muslims in the Middle East. Then about 20 years later, in 1981, she completed her PhD at Cambridge. She got a doctorate. She then immediately got a job in the University of Massachusetts as a professor of Near Eastern Studies. And then a decade later, 20 years later, she became the first professor of women's studies in religion at Harvard Divinity School in Boston, America. So she's had a very academic and colourful journey to get to that point. Now, she has both Arab and Western cultural experience. If you think about the journey that she's been on, She's also she's also had a very lived Islam experience from her family. So this idea of not so much about the ritualistic side of Islam, but more about just living out your life in harmony with others, etc. But she's also experienced the ritualistic, legalistic Islam that came from the state in Egypt at the time. She's also got a grounding in Western influence in Egypt from British teachers, but there was a lot of racism and stereotyping that came with that. And so all of that has influenced what she has written. And so her aim is to, and people often ask, what does she believe? What's her actual opinion here? Well, she seeks to provide a balanced approach to these issues. She doesn't highlight what is right or what is wrong, most likely in respect of not taking a very strong or extreme approach to anything. But what she does in her work is that she describes complex situations and she offers multiple different answers. And so primarily her work is focused on gender and Islam, looking at women's roles in the Muslim world and fighting the stereotypes both in Islam and in the non-Islamic world. And she's become increasingly frustrated over the years by Western feminists. In fact, when she first went to America to work in the universities there, she was aghast at the Western feminists' assumptions about the Arab world. They would very simplistically, with little substance and basis, say that women are oppressed. But at the same time, they would also perpetuate this Western ideology that Muslims and Arabs in particular are ignorant, backward, and uncivilized. If you remember when we looked at Islam and science, there's a moment where we see the shift from the golden age of Islam to a sort of, where there was a dark age in Europe, and then that shifted the balance, and Europe then started seeing Muslims and Arabs as being backward when it was the other way round before that. So these stereotypes are very unhelpful, and Leila Ahmed seeks to challenge them. So in 1992, she published this book, Women and Gender in Islam, which you're reading the chapter conclusions of that. She looks at the history of gender in the Arab world, and she also sees what the implications are for modern Arab feminists. She also looks at Muslim history and couples that with modern day post-colonialism and Arab nationalism, and she puts it all together and offers a balanced discussion of the role of gender in Islam. She traces the treatment of women and goes all the way back to the 7th century AD, which is pretty much starting with the Abbasid dynasty, which you clearly see her talk about in the text. She fights equally against misogynistic views, but also she fights against Western stereotypes. So she tackles the misogyny in organized Islam, and she also tackles the stereotypes from the West that Muslims are primitive. She's very wary of what she coins as official Islam. And going back to her childhood, official Islam, I suppose for her, is linked very much to that Arab nationalism, that very legalistic approach to practicing Islam. She also discusses the veil in her work and sees it as a symbol with complex history, and it's being used currently as a representation of the gender debate that people are having. So ultimately, she seeks to challenge the well-read feminists, and that's sort of said with inverted commas because, these academic feminists in the West, in particular in America, who know very little about Muslim women and their lives in the Middle East, yet they select, very particular things that actually show a misunderstanding of Islam. So they emphasize the polygamy, they emphasize the veil, they emphasize female circumcision, but they have very little understanding of Islam. And they use those things to perpetuate this idea that Muslim women, all of them, are oppressed. And so the work that we're looking at, she herself believes, is a contribution to challenge these problematic views in both the kind of what she refers to as Islamist ideas and Western ideas. But she does believe that her work is incomplete, that it's just scratching the surface of what needs to be said and done on these matters.